Sherri, why don't we start with you?
Okay. Thank you. I'm Sherri Greenberg, professor of practice at the LBJ School of Public Affairs and also assistant dean for state and local government engagement. I'm also part of Good Systems with Matt. And my particular lens as far as misinformation has always been in the policy area. For many years, I have been looking at the intersection of technology and public policy. So that is really my focus on misinformation. What does this mean for society in general? What does this mean for public policy? And are there public policies that we need?
Talia?
Hi, I'm Talia Stroud. I'm a professor in the Moody College of Communication at UT Austin, and I direct the Center for Media Engagement. And my area of specialty is really thinking about how we can work with news media organizations and social media and any type of media out there to improve their practice for the benefit of democracy. And misinformation certainly falls under that umbrella.
Matt?
Hi, Matt Lease. I'm a professor in the School of Information here at UT Austin. Like Sherri, I'm one of the faculty leaders of our Good Systems project on responsible AI technology. And in particular, I lead this project that we just watched the video about, where we're thinking about ways in which responsible AI technology can play a role in helping address problems like disinformation.
Great. All right. So you all know the first question. I'm going to ask you to define misinformation and disinformation and distinguish them from each other. So which one of you wants to tackle that?
Sure. So disinformation is the intentional spread of incorrect information with the intention of deceiving or persuading potentially, whereas misinformation is the inadvertent spread. So you might forward something on that somebody forwards to you, not knowing that it's incorrect in that way.
So what is the scope of the problem for each? There's a lot of misinformation out there that is unintentional, but misguided and thus dangerous. There is some intentional disinformation out there. What is the scale of the problem and how has technology magnified it? Talia, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the trickiness of this is we actually don't know, which is what's really scary. What we're able to know is what have social media platforms, for instance, detected on their platform, but we don't know any of the stuff that they haven't detected. And if you look at what they've detected, it's actually a very small percentage of content that's actually circulating on social media platforms. By and large, most of the content that's on these platforms is, cat memes and friends and things like that. So we know that there's a little bit they can detect. We don't know how much is out there. And then some of the statistics that you'd love to see, which is how much exposure is there to this content. The platforms aren't generally sharing that sort of information. So we don't know how much exposure there is to this content. You can look at things like how often is it shared or how often are people liking this content. But there's a real dearth of data. And so I think we have a lot of questions about how big the problem is. And if we look at instances in which people are reporting on surveys, how much they believe incorrect information or false news, or however you want to frame that, the problem seems to be pretty pervasive because you get a huge percentage of people identifying on those surveys as believing things that are in fact not correct and that have been demonstrated to be not correct by fact-checking organizations and others.
And yes, I think there's a lot that we don't know, and perhaps the people don't agree upon, even the definitions. The definitions that Matt just gave to misinformation and disinformation are in fact the ones that I use. But if you look in a dictionary, they'll give them as synonyms for each other. They're not the same. Okay. And so we're just talking about defining misinformation and disinformation. There's confusion around that. And I would say that Talia is certainly right. What's identified is a small amount, but is that incompetence? Is that negligence? Is that intentional, not identifying it when we talk about policies? And beyond that, whether it is misinformation or disinformation, we do know that controversy sells. And I am one who believes that social media is media. We can talk about that more with policies, but you can go back to the dawn of time with media, and controversy sells. And there are, we know, algorithms, whether you're talking about Facebook or Twitter or YouTube, that are key to this what I'll call controversial information, whether it is true or not.
And we know we're in a information age where knowledge and information drive so much. So of course, anything about information is incredibly powerful. And it's not just the quantity that when we talk about how much is out there. We're trying to think about this from a harm perspective, risk and mitigating harm. So you can talk about how much is out there in quantity. What's the severity? What's the severity of harm if somebody believes this? We also want to think about who's targeted, because different minority communities, for instance, might be disproportionately targeted, or different populations might be vulnerable. So that's what we're trying to really think about, is the risk and harm, which can be quantity as well as severity.
So you made a good point. I want to make sure that our audience knows that we're the Austin Forum on Technology in Society. So much of our conversation tonight is going to be about the role technologies have played in creating or disseminating this. But I do want to go back to that point. There's been misinformation and intentional disinformation, probably as long as there's been two people that had to convince each other of something, right? I'm sure we've seen this through history. I think Talia and I even discussed it in a podcast some time ago. So technology isn't the cause of misinformation and disinformation. That's generally people, but it's certainly an enabler. So maybe each of you could talk about a technology that you are particularly worried about in terms of its role in amplifying misinformation, or worse, disinformation. Matt, you want to start?
Sure. So, I mean, historically, I think William Henry Hearst, who said, "You give me the picture, I'll give you the war," in the mid-19th century. So yeah, this is certainly not a new thing. I think one thing we hear a lot about, makes a lot of sense, is the ways in which platforms are mediating the way we communicate with one another. And so we don't necessarily see the same information. We don't necessarily interact with the same people. And also there is very much this quick twitch response right now, whether it's your tweet that's very fast comes up, that we don't necessarily think and process information the same deliberate way we might have historically. So those are a couple of things I think that offhand are good to address.
One of the things I think about a lot is algorithms, and how algorithms can really amplify misinformation. Because if you think about it, algorithmically, you're more likely to see content from people who are like you. You tend to like their content more, and there's human agency in that as well, right? We tend to be friends more with people who are similar to us. But when we think about mis and disinformation, this is actually really dangerous, because as you're seeing information from people who are similar to you, you are a lot more likely to believe that than misinformation that is against your beliefs or against your politics. So I think when we have both individual choice plus algorithms that are elevating like-minded content to you on social media, I think the possibility for misinformation to not only circulate, but be believed is a really tricky issue that we need to think more about.
And indeed, the algorithms are. I am reminded of a story that I was reading. Someone who had moved to Silicon Valley. She was a researcher, and she was at one of the social media companies and started having some concerns about some things. So she started on her own, getting online, getting on a platform, and doing some searches. And she found, after doing those, that it was sending her to some very bizarre places, right? That weren't even in line with her thinking, but were due to her searches. So again, these algorithms are looking for anything that you are looking at that could potentially lead you to something controversial, because we know from psychology that the brain, right, works with controversy. And so I find this very disconcerting.
Yeah, so just to add to that, if you are a social media company, a lot of your evaluation is from user engagement, the amount of time that people interact, the kind of clicks they do on your platform. And this kind of controversial content is much more likely, sensational content is much more likely to keep. So one problem is there's potentially a value misalignment between what we would want for society in terms of the kind of discourse we want to facilitate and what contributes to valuation of the platforms. And so the algorithms would be trying to maximize.
And that's exactly what I was getting at, the engagement that drives revenues. And even if we step back from that, when you said values, I was doing some research a few years ago with a colleague actually from the School of Information, Ken Fleischman, and the research was looking at AI and ethics. And we interviewed developers of AI, whether they were in academia or industry. We interviewed policymakers, we interviewed lawyers. not to be totally surprised, but the lawyers were concerned about liability, right? Although they may not have known a lot about AI, the policymakers may not have known a lot about AI. They were either concerned about risks, so they didn't want any, or had no concerns at all and weren't looking at how they were implementing it. The developers, though, it was very interesting. Most of them at the time when we interviewed, their attitude was, well, you know, the ethics, how it's used, none of that is in my domain. I'm just developing. And we thought, yes, we probably need some more education and better education to align with training for all three of these groups.
I want to talk a little bit about the technology's role in amplifying now. You all have mentioned social media, and we're not here to vilify social media. I find it enjoyable to share pictures of my daughter and whiskey on, not together, but on social media. But oddly, all my ads are about whiskey too. But anyway, so social media, smartphones, you haven't mentioned that. Is there, as the device, the input device, and the platforms that allow anyone to have a voice, which sounds like a really good thing. Everybody can have a voice. Everybody can publish at some level now. How much have personal computers and laptops and then mobile devices, which are even more pervasive than laptops, how much has that amplified? Has anybody done research on the degree of amplification because of the ease of access to the tool and to the platform on which to post misinformation and disinformation?
I have not specifically looked at the tools. I have looked some at the evolution of the use, and it was actually by members of Congress. In 2012, Congressional Research Service, which is an arm of the Library of Congress, it's the research arm, engaged me and some students to do some research on use of social media by members of Congress and from their actual congressional accounts, not their personal, not their campaign. And so we looked at all of their tweets on Twitter for 3 months, downloaded them, all of their posts on Facebook for 3 months, downloaded them, had about 12 different codes. And at that time, we were not seeing a lot of tweets and posts that were going after, for instance, other members. We saw almost none of it being used for campaign purposes, which it wasn't supposed to be because it was their legislative accounts. What we mainly saw was, this is my position, or what I call, hey, Ma, I'm on TV, look at me, right? And then we did work looking at committees. And then a few years later, about 4 years later, we looked at how members of Congress were using other platforms. And specifically, the one that stood out was YouTube. Right. And this does get maybe some to your question, because video was just becoming so prominent, and not, you know, you could pop up, you know, anybody who has a smartphone, you can pop it open and you can watch YouTube right there on your cell phone. And what we saw was YouTube becoming very prominent. We saw the discourse changing and the nature of the discourse with, you know, more maybe ad hominem and negativity. And we saw that they were going to YouTube because they saw that they could really drive up views via YouTube. And that was becoming a favorite platform at that time over Facebook and Twitter for that reason.
I have two studies, not my own, but ones that I think are really relevant to this conversation. The first is an article that was published in Science. And what they were looking at is, how do fake news and real news stories, or true versus false stories, travel on social media? And it was a very comprehensive analysis. And what they found was that false news travels farther and faster than true news, which is a really kind of alarming finding. The second one is with respect to mobile, which I'm really glad that you brought up. And I have several colleagues that have been evaluating how you process information on mobile. And it turns out that a lot of people, when they're looking at news or even social media on their mobile device, they're moving really fast. So you're using your thumb, you're just scrolling really quickly, and you're not processing as carefully as you would process if you were looking at even on a desktop computer. And so some of their research is suggesting that we're actually more susceptible to believing false news when we encounter it on our mobile device, because we're not as cognitively engaged when we're doing that. You're just quickly zooming through the content. So I think both of those studies, unfortunately, give us room for alarm, but later I think we'll turn to more positive topics.
Yes, I would add to these points Talia was just talking about. So on mobile with a small screen, you're more likely to have a headline fill a lot part of it as opposed to reading the substance. The other thing is you're more likely to be multitasking, looking at your phone in the context of other things. And so, yeah, less cognitively engaged. Sort of a different point that I think is interesting is the way that people consume information and news has really changed. Often it's through, say, apps like WhatsApp or Facebook. And often now with these secure messaging apps, it's actually very difficult for people who aren't getting these messages directly to even know what's happening or how the information is being spread. So that's where we're seeing, like particularly with WhatsApp, the notion of tip lines now coming out when people get something and they're being asked to share it to a group that might go and check it, because otherwise we just don't even see it when it's in these sort of encrypted apps.
You brought up a great point that I want to address there, which is news and the use of these tools to share news. You all are in academia. You know the peer review process is the gold standard for is something true. And that's not a guarantee of truth. It's a guarantee of intent to truth, best information we have at this time, reviewed by objective, often, blind objective review process. So, but the world doesn't work that way. Science works that way, but everything else is maybe there's a publisher and editor, maybe there's a fact checker, but it's not necessarily a panel of experts coming to a consensus on that. So since we're not going to get that, what kinds of things are the companies that are responsible for either making the devices or especially hosting the platforms? What is their responsibility here? And actually, before we get into that, Sherri, maybe you could remind everybody what the First Amendment actually says, because I have a feeling we're going to get into some things that people are going to say, oh, that's a First Amendment issue,
Yes.
which it's not.
Yes. So the First Amendment, freedom of speech, right? That does not apply to private companies, right? It's dealing with the government and freedom of speech. And so often you may be watching a news program and somebody may be talking about, well, that interferes with my freedom of speech if there are restrictions that, Twitter or Facebook puts in. No, that does not. They are private companies. That is not freedom of speech. Freedom of speech refers in our Constitution of the United States to the government interfering with your freedom to speak, right? And so it's something very different. And we can get more into this later, Section 230 and media.
Actually, why don't we get into that right now? Because it's going to set the basis for some of my follow-up questions.
Okay. So I alluded to this in my earlier comments. I believe that social media is media. That's my belief. And I don't think I'm alone in that. There's certainly disagreement. But Section 230 is something that applies to, I guess, what you would call traditional media. And there are standards, right, for what can be on there. And we've had, even with our freedom of speech, right, there's obscenity standards. There are some limitations. I don't know, threatening to kill certain people, there are some standards, but Section 230 does not apply to social media. And the thinking at the time was, well, these are startups and we don't want to hinder them. Really? So Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, I don't think that they fall into that. I do think that they are media. And I personally think that Section 230 should apply to them as it does other media.
Say more about what specifically you think should apply to them differently than is applying right now.
Well, basically they have what I'd call a get out of jail free card, right? There are standards that the media has to adhere to for information, for truth, for veracity, for looking at what's going on and verifying, and that's just not true with the social media. And I think they should have to adhere to the same standards.
Any disagreement from Matt or Talia on that? Do you all three agree with that?
Well, I was going to quickly, I think we're maybe nerding out a little bit on some of the stuff. So we might define and ask you and maybe turn back to Sherri again for a second. So you probably know better than me, the recent FOSTA SESTA stuff happening. So some of you might know Craigslist. Craigslist has had personals for many years. They had to take down personals recently because of this new FOSTA SESTA regulation. So indeed, we had law that encouraged sort of technology platforms to sort of host these sorts of open forums. There was concern, legitimate, that some amount of things are going on like sex trafficking or human trafficking online. And so in developing regulation to try to curb such abuses, it also has the restriction of limiting the kinds of things that we think are useful, like Craigslist. And so these are these challenges about, again, how do we regulate effectively?
Yes, and that's true. And that did just occur. You are correct. I think it's always looking at the costs versus the benefits. But I think continuing to say that entities such as Facebook and Twitter from a policy standpoint are startups and they should not have to adhere to any of the sections in 230 just doesn't ring true to me anymore.
I'll add that my impression is that the platforms are open to some forms of regulation, and that in some ways that would benefit them, because then it would be someone telling them what things they need to be doing in a space that's a little bit of Wild West right now. But I think the thing that I've been working on a project with Meta for the past 2.5 years. And I think the thing that I did not appreciate before I went into this project is the volume. It's just unreal, the volume. And to expect any of these companies to get rid of all misinformation, there's no way, there's no human way anything like that it just can't happen. And so I think that the concern I always have is how do you do this at scale? It's not so simple. And I think that that's a really big deal. And the other thing is, I think we're starting to see more competition in the social media platform realm. So we're getting a lot of new entrants. I think we see people's behaviors changing as they're starting to diversify their social media appetite or their repertoire. And I think that as that is starting to happen, we are going to see a lot of innovation in terms of what platforms allow or don't allow, and how they're dealing with their users. And I'm really excited to see.
I certainly think that's true. You know, the people who are on the different platforms are not the same. People who are using Facebook may be looking at their grandchildren, right? Versus people who are using Twitter. And a lot of people, I use Twitter as a news source. I get feeds from Pew, from all kinds of folks. TikTok is, you know, where many people now are at as far as social media. And I think competition is good, and the free market and the free market of ideas. However, I do still think, and you'll never get 100% on misinformation, but I still do think some standards should apply. And it's because of what we were talking about with the algorithms that are intentionally driving engagement and pushing people towards not just misinformation, but disinformation. And that's why.
Just one last addition. I think we also see that with this diversification of platforms, there's platforms that are also catering to certain verticals or certain demographics. So in the same way too, I think we're seeing more fissures and divisions coming from that, which is another challenge.
So what are the current responsibilities and regulations for these privately held companies that make the devices people use to enter misinformation or disinformation, or host the platforms on which people are spreading it? If they're private companies, first of all, what is the policy or regulation for these tech companies, if any? And what are their own policies? Can you share any insight on these platforms and what they are governed by, if anything, and what they're choosing to do now in 2022?
Many people would like to know about their governance and policies, I would say. Look, they're private companies, so they are, for the most part, self-governing. This isn't, as we said, this isn't the freedom of speech. They're private companies. Section 230 does not apply to them. Of course, there are some laws that do, but for the most part, this is a situation of self-regulation, right? And certainly, we've seen over the past few years, many companies who say they're concerned about ethics and artificial intelligence. They're concerned about misinformation, disinformation. They'll hire people, they'll have departments, but I think there's some controversy about their abilities and how serious they are about these policies and how much attention that they pay to them.
And in terms of policy, I mean, a couple of ways to take your question. One would be like, does the App Store have to host that platform? And no, if they don't, I mean, it's their choice whether they provide that platform or not. And that's fully by the law and by the rules. In terms of internal platforms, a lot of the platforms are beholden to some legislation or some rules like the FTC order, and some of the activity that's actually happening in Europe, I think, is even more restrictive in terms of what the platforms are going to be doing or what they have to do. And so I think that those, but on my read, and please jump in here, Sherri, given your expertise in policy, is that a lot of this is focused on user privacy, much more so than the circulation of mis and disinformation. And, you know, that's a very important thing as well, but it's a little bit of a different focus.
I would agree. Privacy versus transparency. Right. And I think from the policy perspective, we need more transparency regarding misinformation and disinformation and what their internal governance and policies are. And no, you won't be 100%, but what are they actually doing? Are they keeping their policies up to date? So on and so forth.
And maybe building on that, I know inside some of the companies, they have very clear provisions that they outline online about what sort of content that they are taking down. And then companies like Meta work with fact-checking organizations and send them a small percentage of the content on their platform that they think might be suspicious. And then these fact-checking organizations check it and provide those signals back to Facebook so that they can decide, are they going to demote or whatever they're going to do, and Instagram and all the other companies under Meta's umbrella.
And something that maybe AI and algorithms could help with on what I would call the good side is these fact checkers are exhausted. As you said, the volume is incomprehensible. And so is there a way that we can help the fact checkers?
I'm actually going to get to the positives in just a second. We're at about the halfway point, but I want to ask one more question that may have a slightly less than positive response, which is, in each of your minds, what is the greatest problem or couple of problems preventing us from solving misinformation and disinformation? And Talia, you already mentioned scale. So just the vast scale is one. What else are problems that are preventing us from using, from the platforms, from addressing certain codes and standards, and from a technology perspective? What are the challenges right now? The next question, as you can guess, is going to be, what are some promising solutions? But let's focus on the problems and challenges right now. What are you seeing as the big ones in solving this problem?
I can get us started. It is a cat and mouse game. As soon as the platform gets better, people who have some adversarial intent, they get better too. And this is going to be a system that's constantly evolving and changing as people develop new technologies, as deepfakes potentially become a thing. It just seems like it's constantly evolving.
That's like the cybersecurity thing. When you make your system more secure, the hackers figure out a new way to come at it. And so same thing here, whatever policies and tools they put in place, people then find a way around them. Okay, so we've got that, and we've got scale of the problem. What else?
Well, we've talked about incentives and values. Do people want to fix it? I think for that reason. Something else, but let me turn to Sherri for a second. I need to remember.
Okay. So I think that the point you made on Talia is really good. And it goes back to laws, right? We can pass all the laws that we want, but if people have decided they are not going to follow the laws, they are going to break them, they will find a way. And so certainly that is analogous with the point that you just made. And I will, I don't want to be one note, but I do think the algorithms are so important. The algorithms, whether people realize it or not, are driven by values. Okay, even if you think you don't have values, then that's a value. And so I do think, and the algorithms are not, to my knowledge, intelligent on their own yet, right? They are feeding off of human inputs. And so I do think that we need to be paying more attention to the algorithm.
I think the couple of things I want to say is, Casey Newton has done some really amazing reporting. One of the things he talks about is so many people he's interviewed all think that this is done by algorithms. They don't realize actually how much work is being done by people behind the scenes. Usually the people who are moderating this stuff at the platforms are not employees. They're often contractors managed by other companies. And there's all kinds of concerns about essentially protections for those people and the way this work impacts them and the way that companies are or not investing and supporting them. So it's very much as we talk about algorithms, I really want to make sure we understand that there's often people behind the scenes doing very much of the work that seems like algorithm AI magic. So they're really an important part of investing in them.
Exactly. As I say, it's the humans behind the algorithms, and they are overworked. It typically is contracted out, and there could be all kinds of issues regarding language and other situations too that I think may not make this the most efficient.
All right, I'm going to try to summarize where we are so far so I can set us up for the next phase, which is working towards solutions. So we defined misinformation as inaccurate information that is inadvertently possibly spread, and disinformation as a more intentional way of doing it. We talked about these have been around since humans have conveyed information or tried to convince people of something they wanted them to believe, but certain technologies have greatly amplified that capability. More people have access to technologies, both the device and the platform that will host their content, and there's less review than in prior things such as book publishers or journal review and so on. So the problem has grown. It's been enabled by technology. The technology companies can choose their own guidelines for what they will allow. Now, customers, you said there's starting to be some growth in the number of options out there. Their customers, their eyeballs, I should say, because actually their customers are the advertising companies, but their eyeballs can migrate to whichever platform they deem appropriate for their interests. You also mentioned the algorithms and the role that plays in perhaps causing you to see more and more misinformation if you're following people or liking things that are along a certain direction. So the devices and the platforms are enablers. The algorithms reinforce that, as Matt said, for incentive reasons, and Sherri talked about this too. And it's a difficult problem to solve because now the cat's out of the bag. The scale is enormous, and we need tools as well as responsible policies for addressing this. So let's talk about some promising approaches for maybe helping solve this problem. We know we can't suddenly clone an army of fact checkers. So what are some technology solutions to, what are some promising approaches that you've either seen or are seeing come into their own that may be helpful in preventing or at least flagging misinformation and disinformation?
I want to mention one more problem because I think it'll tie into the things we're going to say about it. So there's a way in which you can view, disinformation, misinformation, not as the problem, but as symptoms of the problem, where the problem might be societal polarization, as well as the fact that we have, great power and, money, whatever at stake. Whenever people will do that, all these things will be, as Talia was saying, adversarial attacked. So, we see the rise of hate speech, polarization online. Trying to think about how we might heal some of those divides are going to make people less susceptible to producing and spreading this kind of information. So I think we can talk about technologies to reduce polarization as one thing. Just very quickly, I'll say a couple things. Is we've talked about that there's this sort of quick twitch system one brain where you sort of fight or flight, do things very quickly. So having people slow down, to try to do things, to have interventions where people think a little bit more and engage, maybe reflect before you go and re-forward that tweet. That's something on sort of the maybe lower tech side in terms of interventions. Some of the things that we're thinking about on kind of the higher end is in terms of AI technologies where we can try to accelerate the work of content moderators, fact checkers, or even folks at home who are looking at information. So if you don't trust CNN or you don't trust PolitiFact, why would you trust a black box AI algorithm telling you what's true or not? So to this extent, we're trying to investigate explainable AI technologies so that AI can present the evidence and the reasoning to help you understand why it's considering to do that to help you with your decision making, just like you might search Google to try to get information to make a better decision. We also are trying to think about fairness and fair AI. So there's maybe, again, different groups that might be disproportionately impacted by disinformation, by ways that we can think about trying to be aware of that and manage how we respond is ways that we can also try to ensure that we are developing technologies that are fair in supporting different groups.
So I have one that's not necessarily tech, although it can be depending on where you are in your life. And I alluded to it, and that's education. I think that this should be part of education from the time that students are starting school, and certainly through if they're doing post-technical training or college, and even through PhDs, that this really needs to be part of their education and courses that they take, so that whether people are going to be policymakers or lawyers or entrepreneurs or developers in engineering and computer science, that they have this content as part of their education.
And another tech solution that I'll share is we've been really trying to figure out how we can help local news organizations get some of this information, because right now the ecosystem is really weighted so heavily to nationally circulating misinformation. And if I were a bad guy, I would totally go after local. I would totally go after local ecosystems. I would find those that were really pivotal in election. I would figure out how their media ecosystem is going, since we see all sorts of newspapers closing and we see cuts to staff at other news organizations. And that's where I would attack. And the thing that's so worrisome about that is that it's basically, there's nothing there. The platforms aren't really monitoring that because it's not at the scale that they would pick it up through any of their algorithmic detection for misinformation. And then we don't have people on the ground. So what we've been really trying to think through is, are there signals that you can identify from social media or from Google searches at local levels to try to figure out when is misinformation starting to spike at the local level? And then can you prioritize that? So a newsroom can say, okay, this is cropping up right now. We need to get on this and fact check it immediately. And so I'm really passionate and have been working with a team trying to think through how can we empower local news organizations to figure out what's happening locally.
I think that's so important. If you look back to the 1990s, some of you may not have been around then, but if you look back to the 1990s and you went down to the Texas Ledge, as we say, you know, the Pink Dome, there were so many media organizations there that were local. You wouldn't, every town of any size had media in person at the Texas legislature. There was a whole huge room with desks for them. You know, there were cities such as Houston that had 2 newspapers and they were both there. You had TV, you had radio. Now there are so few local news organizations of any type. And so I think, Talia, your point is a very important one.
On the algorithm side, I mean, partly it isn't even anything new we need, you know, in terms of how we choose to control what's in a news feed or what people see has a lot of influence. You see, what you see becomes normative and shapes all the way you think. So a lot of the research around content moderation has been, how do we detect objectionable stuff and remove it? But instead, if you try to promote the good stuff and bring that to more people, that actually has a larger impact on the way that people behave and change their, you know, sort of information diet and response. Another thing I think we might think of is ways in which we can try to promote civil discourse a little more online, ways we can use technology to help influence, guide, nurture those conversations in ways that promote healthy discourse.
And I think, Matt, some of what you're referring to is something that I've been delving more into, and that is psychology in politics and in public policy. And so much of what we do in our daily lives, whether we realize it or not, is driven by psychology, whether it is what drives us to news feeds, whether it is our discourse. And I think that we should be paying more attention to, in fact, psychology when we're talking not just about misinformation, but disinformation, but also politics and public policy.
And I'll just make one more comment here that I think is relevant. So there's a collaboration that's starting up called New Public. And what they're trying to do is figure out how we can create new social media platforms that from the beginning have the goal of healthy democratic discourse right at the core. And it's more of a nonprofit sort of a model than it's more of like a public library model, since we're here, than it is a for-profit model. And I think that that's just a really exciting way to do it. And since we started New Public, one of the questions we were asking at the very beginning is, what would you want algorithms to promote? What would be the good thing that you would want to see more of? And it's just a totally different way of asking the question that's picking up on what Matt just mentioned, that I think revitalizes what social media could be.
I'm going to dive into AI a little bit here specifically. Talia, you brought up that there's a tremendous challenge in fact checkers. They can't possibly, review all of the information that all of us could be posting right now. But there is one way to keep up with the spread of information, and that's using the very same tools that people are using it. So using the computational infrastructure, the cloud infrastructure, and having good AI models. We know that Google and others monitor your searches in real time and other things in real time. It's certainly possible to inference against an AI model for whether something contains, what the confidence is that it contains largely good information, or lower confidence in that, or even a confidence that contains lots of bad information. What is the state of the art of that, though? And I asked because I had a friend who 2 years ago got his first COVID shot. And we all know the misinformation that was out there about COVID shots and 5G. And he posted, "Just got my COVID shot and my 5G reception is great." It got 300 of those, and then Twitter flagged him for a day for misinformation. So I know AIs aren't good at sarcasm and humor yet, but getting better, and they can be trained. Where are we now in AI being able to peruse a news article and automatically at least give some reasonable confidence of whether it's good or inaccurate?
It's a great question. I think we've made advances, but I think, as your example illustrates, we're nowhere near where we could be to be able to feed it an article and say, like, is this true or not? And have it be perfect at that detection, like not even kind of in the realm. And there are so many stories like the one you shared where people are being flagged for misinformation for reasons of sarcasm or just an inadvertently bad choice of words for something. So I really don't think that we're there yet. And if you look at the public sector and efforts to try to inform the public of good sites, bad sites, they're really doing a lot of that at the domain level. So saying this is a domain that we've historically found has shared problematic content. Even inside platforms, they're looking at things like at the page level or at the account level, not delving into one specific piece of content and being able to tell with any precision whether that's true information or not true.
Yeah, I agree. I have not seen anything that is of that level at this point in time. But as I was saying, I think it holds promise. Can we have AI that helps the fact checkers? I think it's a goal, but I have not seen anything of that level yet. No.
So I think part of your question was poised as, can we look at a given article and say something about the reliability of information? And there's definitely a lot of great work happening there. But I think so much is what Talia was saying, sort of more source-based. So a great shout out to the Disinformation Index, which is doing a lot to try to index these sites that are known to sort of be spreading this kind of information. So one of the great things they do is not only the technology to identify these sites, but they have a mass of lawyers for all the lawsuits they get. And basically what happens is all these other places can't afford the litigation risk. So they just use the different Disinformation Index and they take the lawsuits for everyone else to kind of be a front for that. But it's so political. I worked with a major public health organization during the pandemic, and they were politically not allowed to sort of look at essentially source information about where it was coming from and deciding what was reliable for public health, actors. So we had to do this kind of content-based analysis for that, which was really problematic. But I think this sort of analysis of how information spreads through providers, where it comes from, and provenance are hugely effective signals. I also want to mention this project that we're doing at the university around trying to support fact checkers around disinformation. It's not just about the fact check itself. There's a lot else that goes in, for instance, choosing what things to even do fact checks on. So there's, as Talia was mentioning, the volume of information is far beyond what the fact checkers can take a look at. partly we're trying to accelerate their work so that when they decide to do a fact check, they can do so more efficiently, or we can figure out how to leverage experts or volunteers to help. But it's also really important in just triaging what to fact check. And that comes everything from when the material comes off of news or social media, what kind of processing pipeline you go to figure out what is the claim that's emerging, and then how do we prioritize those claims for consideration. Technically what you're saying for local news.
Yeah, I love that. And there's such a strategic element to that because you don't want to amplify it accidentally. So if it's something that's just on the fringe and in one small area, you don't want to be the organization that then sheds light on it, because the way that you talk about misinformation can inadvertently lead people to remember that as true. And that's just the way we process things. So it's a very tricky, there's a human element to these decisions that's exceptionally challenging.
There is. And, it's just like in a political campaign, you have to decide whether or not you're going to mention your opponent's name, right? Because mentioning the name can have a disadvantage of giving them more publicity. And I think we do need trusted sources, but how do we find those trusted sources? Do we have an index? Do we look at models that I've been thinking about of how in our daily lives we find trusted sources? During COVID, I was chair of Central Health, a local government here that provides healthcare to people very low income. And of course, we were alarmed immediately by the misinformation and disinformation that we were seeing. We knew that some of our clients use Twitter, some use Facebook, different platforms. Some we were actually going door to door, just door to door, knocking on people's doors with information. We were using trusted sources in their communities. And so this really has made me think about, can we develop these trusted sources when it comes to technology and misinformation and disinformation? What would those trusted sources be?
One last quick fact that's relevant is we know that the way this stuff spreads, and as Sherri mentioned, the psychology, the way it gets believed, if you don't get a fact check out within 30 minutes of when this stuff starts to spread, it's too late in terms of really exponentially diminishing returns. The beliefs get embedded and they're very hard to dislodge at that point. One thing we also haven't talked about tonight yet is pre-bunking. So the idea of pre-bunking is like inoculating people. So the same kinds of disinformation, either the same stories or the same genre of disinformation, continues to spread in repeating cycles, such that you can anticipate before an event happens what the disinformation might be around it, and you can try to inoculate people against it before it happens. So that's sort of another promising direction.
Yes, it is. And it's some of what we were doing during COVID. Okay, we've seen that this happened when something happened during COVID, with masking or vaccination. We can anticipate what's going to come next and try to, as you said, inoculate, be preventative, go to those trusted sources, knock on the doors. So how do we do that, right? How do we create those trusted sources? How do we create those door knocks?
Great. I have two more questions, and you know what they are because we prepped a little bit ahead of time. And then we're going to turn it over to our audience questions. And I've got a special guest who's going to pick the audience questions, including the winner. But as you might remember from our discussion, the last two questions are, what can attendees here tonight in the room or online, what can they do to protect themselves from disinformation and misinformation? After we get through that one, the follow is going to be, what can their companies and organizations do? But let's start with the individuals, since I think the company and organization answer may build on that. What do each of you recommend to everybody in this audience to protect themselves from believing misinformation or disinformation?
So there's been so much criticism of, quote, mainstream media in recent years, but the way that Jay talked about peer review, this is what mainstream media does and does very well, is really try to provide a trusted resource for that. So I think one thing we can do is question the skepticism we have around the mainstream media and providing us a lot of information. Another thing we can do is slow down. So try to get out of that system one quick twitch brain to really think about something. And when next time you go to reply or forward something on, give it a second to digest. Sherri mentioned information literacy. So this is something that's incredibly important, that we should be skeptical readers of what we read in general and try to cross-connect different pieces of information to corroborate what we read. And since, again, Sherri has mentioned public schools, I think this is also something that libraries have traditionally played a huge role in that we should recognize. So that's something we can do in general, is invest not only in public education, but in our libraries to support this kind of information literacy.
That is a well-timed plug for tonight's venue. Thank you.
I would add that we all have a role to play. And if you are seeing something that you think is misinformation circulating on social media, oftentimes you can see like the little 3 dots over on the right-hand corner or something like that. You can actually report it. And that's a signal that actually social media platforms do use. So if you see misinformation, report it. And that helps you, that helps everyone, that helps the next person that's looking at that might not recognize it as misinformation.
Read. And read the fine print and read carefully. Get away from the little lizard brain. But beyond that, I think that it's really important that you read with a skeptical eye. And one of the courses that I've taught over the years to graduate students is public finance. And for some students to see a spreadsheet, to see a balance sheet, to see just a page in front of them with numbers, it's just swimming around. I said, you are the detective, right? This is telling you a story, right? Whether you're reading a novel or whether you are looking at numbers, there is a story here and you are the detective. And the first thing to ask yourself when you look at these numbers, and maybe there's a total at the end, or, there's assets, is, could this possibly be true? Just start with asking yourself that question. Could this possibly be true?
Yeah, I think one more thing is we're thinking about. So I mentioned sort of societal polarization, ways in which hate speech or disinformation can be symptoms of that. I think if we give it a little bit of thought, how we choose to look at it is whether we believe that there's more that unites us or that divides us, whether we have more in common or are more in separate spheres of the world with different people. So I think the more that we can try to actually embrace learning more about other people who are different than us, accepting the fact that people who might have different beliefs than us might be well justified in doing that, what we do then is we take away the fuel that disinformation runs on, and we make ourselves much more robust against it.
That's a very important point, because there was a time when we had civil discourse and you could disagree with someone's opinion, but that didn't mean that that person was disagreeable.
All right. Final question from me before we turn it over to audience questions is same question, but for the companies and organizations that many of these people are leaders and decision makers in. Many of those are tech companies that maybe make tools that are particularly relevant, but we also have people from all kinds of companies in here. So what's your advice for their companies and organizations to play a role in helping prevent misinformation and disinformation?
Well, I think it has to be a priority. When I talk about public policy and I say, well, people can campaign and have all the pretty platforms and this or that. But if you want to know from a public policy standpoint, what's important to a government, what's important to elected leaders who are the decision makers, look at the budget. Look at what they decide to spend money on in that budget and how much money they spend on it. Those are their priorities, right? And so I think that if companies are serious about this, it has to be a real priority. It can't just be a platitude. It can't just be something on the website. There have to be real efforts, real policies, and you have to see that they're putting some muscle behind it.
Just repeating 2 quick things I said earlier. Of course, we can invest in public education. We can invest in libraries. I think we can also choose to support political candidates who we think are going to advance those kinds of positions that we think are important for society. Of course, the most important thing you can do is get out your checkbook for the University of Texas at Austin to support our research. But otherwise, I think there are ways in which you can try to organize people in your organization to come together, have reading groups, have discussion groups, ways to help us find ways to talk to each other and get to know one another and realize that somebody who maybe looks different than you or who you haven't had a chance to interact with, you again might have more in common with them than you have that differentiates you.
Matt just gave another good plug there. We have our online discussion groups about various tech and society books. And Talia has given a recommendation for a book to me tonight that is very relevant to that. So it'll probably show up this topic in book discussion form in a few months for the Austin.
Actually, you got two recommendations. I had one too. So we have two books.
All right, Talia, you want to close it out?
Sure. So I think that companies have a role to play in this, not only in educating their workforce to make sure that they're aware of the possibility of mis and disinformation, but I think also just monitoring your own corporate image. And there are mis and disinformation attacks against corporations all of the time. And if you're not contracting with someone or having someone on your staff that's monitoring for that, I think you may be in trouble at some point. So those would be my two takeaways.
Great. Thank you very much. All right. We are going to move to your questions now. And I'm very pleased to introduce a new partner of the Austin Forum, Optiver. Optiver has offices around the globe, but we're very fortunate. They have a large number of people here in Austin. They have two people on our advisory board, Scott Richardson and Luke Wilson. Please raise your hands. So please welcome them to the Austin Forum. And we specifically seek partners that use technology, make technology, support people who use or make technology. We want that theme in there. You're going to hear from Optiverse about technology and finance and markets in February at an Austin Forum event. But I did want to introduce Scott to come up here and be the one that selects some of the questions from the audience. And Scott, we probably have time for about 4 or 5 questions, and save your badge winner for last. All right. Please welcome Scott Richardson.
Nice to meet everybody. Looking forward to joining you guys for drinks and pizza afterwards. So thanks you guys for joining. So first, from Teresa, is anyone on the panel concerned about Elon Musk having control over information via Starlink and what that could mean for future elections and more in Ukraine and other areas where Starlink is donated? Tough one.
I don't have enough to say about this particular issue. I would say in general, we saw in the Great Recession, the issue of too big to fail with the banks. I think in general, whenever we have too few organizations that have too much control over what people see or hear about, it's going to be a problem. So the kind of proliferation or diversification of information channels that we make available to people, I think are important for an informed public.
I would agree. I would like to see more competition. I would like to see the free market, not monopolies. And I think that would be very helpful to us in this way.
Quick question from me while I have the mic. Would you say with more competition on these platforms, this makes the problem of disinformation, misinformation easier or more difficult?
I think it makes it more difficult because now you have mis and disinformation going across platforms. And right now, the way that the structure is set up, the platforms don't really collaborate. So if one platform is detecting something that's happening and doing a deep investigation, they're not alerting other platforms of that. So as you have more and more platforms, you have more and more opportunity for disinformation to circulate. And you have platforms that are essentially telling people, come here to spread disinformation. And so that is also very worrisome.
All right, thank you. So this is from Aldo. What is the realistic goal of misinfo, disinfo improvement? Do we have any real metrics we can speak of to actually really measure it?
Well, one simple thing is we talk about sort of counting and volume where we can do that. So we have a sense of how much our professional fact checkers we're working with can do, per day, per month, whatever. And so ways in which we can potentially use technology to expedite their work was one way we could sort of take a look at how many things they can get at. I think we have other metrics for saying in terms of the things that get checked, what we think they're covering in terms of degree of harm, or again, different groups being impacted. So I think we do have some metrics in that space for trying to quantify improvements.
I think the platforms are looking at how many people are exposed to misinformation that they're detecting on the platform, how quickly they're able to detect it. So how much leverage does a coordinated influence campaign, for example, have? Does it reach a lot of people or very few? How much time is it before they detect it? So I'd say time, volume, exposure.
So on a global level, I believe that there are facts, that some things are either true or false. And I will stray a little, but I will just say, maybe when we look at an election and we see how many people believe the results and how many people don't.
This is from David. Sherri, you made a comment about search engines. And your comment is not only about one of information, but about culture, ethics, and policy. And the question David had was, is there a way that we can make search or more transparent on a policy level, or is that a little bit out of reach?
So on a policy level, it's hard to mandate transparency on a search. I do think that there are some codes of conduct, some ethics, some standards that I would like to see adopted. And I think that we could potentially, an idea that I had with a colleague, Ken Fleischman, for Day One Project, is at the federal level to convene industry people, all the stakeholders, academics, nonprofits, and everyone to see if we can come up with standards. Also, I think if we demand transparency, right? We're the ones who either choose to get on or not get on. There are stockholders. I think that if people demand more transparency, in the private sector with the profit motive, you can get some responses.
One of my academic hats is search engines, so I can say a little here. One is, I think, most of us are most familiar with Google, but there are sites like LexisNexis that cater to, say, lawyers or for doctors who are doing systematic reviews. And for them, they choose to use a technology which they know for every word in their query, they're guaranteed whether that word will or will not show up in the search results they get back. So they choose to use something that we don't think of as the latest, greatest state-of-the-art AI because it provides incredible control and transparency in what they do. So this is very common in some of the more, again, professions where that kind of security is really important. So I think some of the work that's happening now in kind of more state-of-the-art AI and search engines is we're trying to think about how is it that we can bring, ideally the best of both worlds, that same level of control and transparency you get with a Boolean query, along with the sort of AI magic that we like to think about from sort of modern search engines.
All right, thanks. So last question, and what we deem to be
drum roll,
best one, or maybe the hardest one. So we talked a lot about technology solutions to problems. And we also talked about how much of the disinformation, misinformation is amplified by retweets, likes, and shares. People get attracted to the most controversial headlines. And we all, I think, touched on the need to slow down, whether take a second to think, to breathe. And the question was, how can technology be used to guide people into actually slowing down and thinking more critically before sharing to their networks?
There's been a really great series of research projects right now where they're basically just sending people a direct message and saying to them, is the following accurate? And that is enough to actually change people's behavior and their probability of sharing mis and disinformation. So I think that there are actually very subtle nudges that can actually improve the way in which people are dealing with mis and disinformation, which I think is rather encouraging.
I love that, because that seems similar to my "could this possibly be true" question, right? I love that. But I think that it is slowing down in our lives in more ways than just this. I think that people need to discover fun again. The Power of Fun, a book I recommend. And I think that they need to discover ways perhaps in which they used to use or could use technology for sheer fun. And those are some recommendations that I would have, as opposed to spending hours and hours in this vicious cycle.
Maybe just sort of at the simplest level of all is there's been interventions where when you get something, in order to reply, the reply button doesn't work until you've sat there for 5 seconds or something like this, right? And so just things like that, that just actually require people to read a little bit. Have you scrolled down on the page at all? You have to scroll down before we're going to open up.
Like those forms that you can't submit until you've gone all the way through them. I know it can be annoying, but really it's a similar concept where you have to look at each one, you have to fill out each one before you can hit the submit button. Now, I am fond of calling the send button the ugly button. And I call it that because, remember, once you hit that button, everyone in the world has it, and it has a shelf life of forever.
So before, you just have to select all the stoplights on the images before you can hit the send or something like that. All right, thank you.